Welcome back to the show, everyone. My guest today is, for the third time on this show, Aaron Franz of theageoftransitions.com. He's an author, filmmaker, and researcher with a particular interest in the technological singularity, transhumanism, and eugenics. Back in 2008, he produced the documentary The Age of Transitions, which to this day still receives a great degree of attention, so you can check that out on YouTube. You can also get his book, Revolve, Man's Scientific Rise to Godhood. Aaron, thank you very much for joining me again today.
Thank you for having me. It's always great to talk to you.
Yeah, we've had a couple of really good conversations in the past. I'm sure today will be more of the same. As we record this, I think it's probably been maybe 4 or 5 months since we last spoke.
Really? Wow.
I think so, yeah. Time really does fly.
It does.
So I think probably the natural place to start is just to ask you, what have you been up to over the last 4 or 5 months?
Well, work has continued at ageoftransitions.com. I've been doing quite a few podcasts. I've got a new podcast series with Adam of Cerebral Revolt where it's called Themes and Memes. We review movies from a standpoint where we kind of pick apart propaganda in movies, more or less. So that's a new thing. And it's just business as usual, basically.
Very good. And I understand you're about to start, or I guess you kind of, by the time this comes out, you would have started a brand new podcast series.
That's right, yeah. So I'm going to interview a number of folks who are producing alternative media with the focus on alternative media itself. Just want to get the opinions of people who produce alternative media, the good points of it, the bad points, where it may be going in the future, things like this. And I'm going to be hosting you on that podcast series very soon, so listeners should definitely check that out.
Very good, and they can find all of that at ageoftransitions.com. You mentioned in your first response there, Aaron, that you're doing some work picking apart propaganda in films and entertainment and things like that. Are there any recent instances, perhaps some relatively new films or new television programs that have just come out where you see kind of the propaganda machine really at work?
For me, it's hard to find a film or a TV show that isn't a piece of propaganda. There's quite a few that aren't, of course, but I mean, certainly some shows and movies are, it's so easy to tell that that's what it is. A lot of these shows and movies are produced in tandem with the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, intelligence services such as the FBI, CIA. All those alphabet agencies have their entertainment liaison offices, and they work directly with producers from Hollywood to create these films and TV shows, and they get to add in themes, add in characters, rewrite the script, all that. For the producer gets access to, military vehicles, locations, and also personnel. So they get sort of consultants for the script and also extras and things like that. So you'll find that there's a lot of that going on, but also just beyond that, that doesn't even have to be the case for a film to be propaganda either.
Well, there might be some people listening to this who are thinking to themselves right now, that's quite an outlandish statement to suggest that there is that kind of relationship between people who are involved in producing or sponsoring films and the intelligence services. So could you be specific and kind of point to any examples where, that's it's very much evident that was the case?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll say, first of all, there's a lot of news articles about this. Just type in Pentagon Hollywood, and they'll pop up. And the Air Force is big with the example from them is the Transformers 1 and 2 movies were produced in tandem with the United States Air Force. Let's see here. What else? I don't know in terms of the TV shows, but there's got to be a number of them working with the Department of Homeland Security with the ones that focus on terrorism and things like that. To be honest, I haven't looked into that as much as I should have. But there's example after example. All you got to do is just type it in the search engine. You'll find tons.
Sure, and I guess we can refer to our mutual friend Tom Secker, who I know has done a lot of work looking into that stuff as well. So
Yep.
I think he's a good resource for people. Well, As I mentioned in the introduction, and as I'm sure a lot of people listening will know, you do a lot of work around the area of transhumanism, and it's quite interesting. According to a recent Huffington Post article, mentions of transhumanism and life extension science have tripled in 2013 in major media. Have you been, because you've been following this stuff for a very long time, so have you been cognizant of the fact that transhumanism seems to be becoming very much a mainstream topic, at least it has this year?
Yeah, definitely for a while now. I could tell that it's a big talking point in media, and just over and over again for years now, since they started to promote the idea of transhumanism. I don't know if you're going to date it. Right around 2008, when the Age of Transitions documentary I made came out, that was when it was really kind of kicking into gear. And as you said, now it's just crazy how many pieces you see. But when you watch a few of these, you'll notice they're always saying the same things. They're always hitting the same points. So it gets kind of boring, to be quite honest, because it's just the same thing over and over and over again. But that's the nature of putting the idea out there.
And what are those points that seem to consistently come up time and time again?
Well, they do deal with ethical considerations, I guess they'd say, that have to be brought up, because these sorts of technologies are so challenging to actually the human being itself, because the whole idea of transhumanism is to redesign humanity to the point where it really isn't even humanity anymore. It's post-human. That's the word they use. So, of course, that's a challenge. So people take it as a challenge, and they take offense to it with good reason. And so, they throw plenty of questions out there to say, hey, look, why should we end the human race? Why is this a good idea? And what about killer AI that's going to take over, as in the movie Terminator? And, all those sorts of questions, problems with life extension, problems of equity, and will the rich just have it, and what will the poor do? And so it's just the same ideas over and over again. There are answers to all those questions that, again, you hear over and over again.
Yeah, it's become quite clear to me, I would say, over the last couple of years, that this is really a very serious topic. I mean, when I first encountered it, it just, I think to many people it sounds like science fiction, and it sounds like this will never happen. It's just maybe a small band of people that believe in this stuff. But as we're seeing now, there are powerful people with a lot of influence that are really using that influence in this field to try to push this whole idea forward. And that's pretty concerning. And I think I mentioned this last time we spoke, but it says a lot about us as the human race, that, we're that there are people who are actively discussing and planning, basically ending the human race and merging with technology and so forth. When you look at the increased coverage that transhumanism is getting and transhumanist themes in the media, particularly the major media, do you see it as are they sort of treating it with the seriousness that really it needs to be taken?
I'd say no. That's a really good question, actually. A lot of times they'll kind of bring it back into the realm of fiction, because that's how most people are familiar with these topics. They're like, oh, I saw that idea in a movie once. That's funny.
That's the reference point, isn't it, for most people, I guess?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would say that's not by accident either, and there's a lot to talk about with that. But they will make jokes of stuff. They're like, oh, killer robots. Oh, that there's all sorts of like nonsensical stuff like that. And that's a way of keeping the topic more lighthearted, and so that it's easier to digest. And then also just the focus and some of the sillier questions they tend to focus on keeps the conversation away from certain areas that I think it absolutely has to be in. Namely, I would say how this topic ties in with military-industrial complex is very important. You'll never, ever, 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 ever really hear a link between transhumanism and the technological singularity and DARPA or anything to do with the Department of Defense. You just won't see it on any of these shows.
So let's use this show as an opportunity to go into that. What is the link between those things? Well,
I would say the promotion of these technologies is one thing, but then it comes down to the question of development of these things. People will say, okay, well, if these technologies are coming, who's producing them? And in shows, sometimes they'll show like a little company, but a lot of times you'll find that company has contracts with the DoD. Lots of times they kind of, they'll mention it a little bit here, but they won't get too deep into that. And just all sorts of nanotech, certainly AI, and all the other transhuman technologies. There's like super soldier initiatives and all. There's so much. It's being produced through the military industrial complex, the big tech firms involved in that primarily.
Another thing that I'd like to get your take on is the fact that a lot of people have commented that Hollywood seems to have some major transhumanist themes in upcoming movies next year. And, a lot of people are saying that's further evidence that this is becoming more of a mainstream subject. Is that anything new in your book, or is this, simply a continuation of what's been happening for a while?
Well, it definitely is a continuation, but like you said earlier, it seems to be happening more and more and more, and they're picking up speed. And the idea is more and more familiar, so it's easier to hit now. And whereas it was just pure fiction even a decade ago, now that the idea of transhumanism has been planted and people are like, oh yeah, they're talking about actually doing these sorts of things, now it's in a whole new sort of space for people, and people are thinking about it in a different sort of way, I guess you'd say.
And one sort of, arena or one instance of where transhumanism and the technological singularity and so on has been discussed was on Joe Rogan's new show, Joe Rogan Questions Everything. And myself and James Wilson, we've been reviewing those shows on this podcast. But one of them dealt with some of the themes that we're talking about today. I'd like to ask you specifically about a couple of things in that episode, Aaron. But to get us started here, what were your overall thoughts and perceptions on how the subject was treated in that show?
Well, I'd say that it was sort of a fun sort of thing. Again, this would be a lighthearted take on the subject, again, in my opinion. And Joe Rogan himself I know that he's been talking about these sorts of ideas a lot. I know that he genuinely is interested in this, which is cool. So it's good that he actually cares about it. It's not just some host just going through the motions, I guess. But I'm trying to think what to say about it. It was, in terms of hearing the same ideas over and over again, there was definitely quite a bit of that going on, just because that's the nature of these shows. So, yeah.
Was it an oversimplification in your view? And obviously you're someone who's studied this quite a lot, so you know the ins and outs of it, but really, and of course there were time constraints, they really couldn't explore the topic too far, but did they kind of just break it down to the lowest common denominator?
I think so, but again, like you're saying, I'm a little bit biased because I've been looking at this for so long, and now everything's just become like, okay, I've heard this before.
Yeah. So there wasn't really sort of too much new content for you to take away from the show?
Well, there were just a couple little details that, for me, were interesting, yeah.
One person who was spotlighted in that episode was Ray Kurzweil, and he was actually called one of the smartest men in the world.
Yeah, yes, he was.
He made some very provocative statements. At one time he said, we will merge with technology. He was very forthcoming and very direct with that statement. He said, we will gradually become non-biological, and at that point we're effectively robots. And another thing that he said was, we'll be able to overcome things that make our existence too short. So some very interesting statements. We may have talked about this in the past, but what are your sort of general thoughts on Ray Kurzweil, and what do you think about how he was presented in this show? Yeah,
well, his introduction to me, to me it was deplorable. Like, one of the smartest guys in the world. It's like, oh, please, like that. I didn't like that at all. But if we're talking about Ray Kurzweil, who he is the face for the technological singularity. He is the spokesman. And along with technological singularity, you get transhumanism too. It's really the same thing. So he's the big guy out there pushing the idea. And it's sort of turned into this whole generic concept, of course, as things are with spokespeople, that like he created the idea and he's made these predictions and this is the man we go to and it's all about him. And When in actuality, we can understand that this is a huge group project. If this is gonna come about, he's just the one who's talking about the phenomena, but also with Ray Kurzweil, he does have he's definitely a connected guy, and he's an interesting character to say the least. I know that they made a documentary about him, which is actually the documentary is pretty good on him.
Well, I think the kind of mainstream view towards him at this point is that he is one of the leading thinkers of the day. He's kind of a modern day genius, someone who will be regarded as such, in the future. Could you give your case for why people maybe should look at the work that he's doing a little more critically?
Sure. Well, again, He's talking about the technological singularity. He's talking about these huge changes which are going to affect everybody. And again, he's not talking so much about the current state of things. That would be my main objection with the whole transhumanist sales pitch in general. Is they're not talking about, okay, where are we with AI and what sort of development is going on in AI and what AI projects are actually out there in use now. It's never about that, because those are much more mundane AI projects, or what you call narrow AI projects. I know we talked about this last time we talked, but it's very, very important to mention this. So narrow AI. Narrow AI is not a sentient being. It can't think. It's not going to become self-aware. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is just to recognize patterns in huge data sets in order to make use of that. So, you've got huge databases of information, and there's all sorts of ways to collect data now, and you throw it into a database. And people's a way that people just kind of like throw that off and like, oh yeah, my data's being collected, but who cares, because nobody'd ever be able to sift through all that data and make any use of it anyway. So they just got all set. What are they going to do with it? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to put a narrow AI machine at task to find patterns in the data and be able to link your data to all the other people who have their data in this database, whatever it happens to be. So it makes connections between the entire world. So that's what AI is doing now. It's all about picking apart this sort of information, making use of it where human beings cannot make use of it. And you'll never hear anybody pushing the singularity idea, anybody into transhumanism or AI. Even if you ask them about this, they divert the question.
Interesting. Another character that was spotlighted in that episode was the billionaire Dmitry Itskov. And I have to confess, I wasn't familiar with Dmitry prior to watching this show. I'm not sure if you were, Aaron. If so, could you give us any sort of background to who he is and why he's interested in this subject?
I had not heard of him before, and he's somebody I'm going to have to look into, because you'll find all sorts of sort of tycoon characters like this will pop up. I know Peter Thiel of PayPal fame. He's been big into the whole singularity scene, and I've not heard of Dmitry yet, but the interview they did with him I thought the interview of him was one of the best parts of that Joe Rogan show, actually, and it was very telling. And you could tell that guy was, he's legitimate in what he's doing. He really does want to become a god and all that business. Like, he means it when he says that. And so it was a heartfelt sort of interview they got from him, and I think pretty telling there.
Yeah. I want to get your reaction to several statements that he made, because, again, quite provocative, eye-opening statements. He basically said, as human beings, we are facing multiple crises, and we are responsible for those crises. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's that is really the way that transhumanism has to be framed and is framed, in this sort of apocalyptic sense. And like, look, the world has gone crazy. We can see that clearly, and there's plenty of examples of that. And it's all falling down, and the world's coming to an end. What we need is an ultimate solution to everything. And you'll find that the problems that have brought about Armageddon, supposedly, have everything to do with the human being and the weaknesses of the human being. It's because we have created so much pollution that the earth is dying off, and it's because we're so weak that we can't solve our basic problems. And if only we were smarter, we'd be able to take science into a realm where we'd be able to solve all these medical problems. And so the answer to all those great problems come from these converging technologies that are involved with transhumanism. It's definitely an apocalyptic idea.
Right. So would you say that's a fairly common sentiment that's put out there, that's used as justification for this whole movement? The fact that, things are terrible, things are worse than they've ever been. We've put ourselves in this position, therefore we need to essentially get rid of ourselves.
Yes, definitely. And you'll find that degradation of the human being is done over and over and over again to quite sickening lengths, too, by transhuman promoters. And we're like, oh, yeah, the human being is just terrible anyway. Why would we even want to keep it? And, we could create something better. And they just... It gets to almost a cartoony thing where they start saying oh, we have bowel movements and why don't we get rid of that? And why don't we, reproduction, human reproduction is a mess. Why don't we just change the whole deal? And it gets into that kind of just, to me, it's cartoony and silly, but it always goes there over and over again.
Yeah. We had an excerpt of his closing remarks at they showed it in the show, whatever that particular conference was, and in some of his closing remarks he said the goal is to transform humans to godlike humans. And, this is something, again, I know we've talked about in the past, but how strong is, that belief in the transhumanist community that if all of this is possible, we could become gods, and that's kind of like the overall ultimate goal?
Yeah, I think that's a huge motivating factor, and I think it's something that they actually believe and look forward to. And there's a lot of philosophical sides to this, a lot of occult and esoteric sides to this too. And I really do. Well, for me, I know that this topic links in with alchemy, the age-old esoteric quest to achieve the Philosopher's Stone, immortality. It's about doing that literally. So achieving eternal life, becoming godlike, and enhancing intelligence. It's quite a study. I've devoted a lot of time to it. I wrote my book Revolve. It gets into the alchemical part, and then really you have to kind of look at that angle of this to understand where they're coming with that and how this is a religion for them. And I guess with Kurzweil's documentary, the way they ended that, they asked him the question, do you believe in God? And he said, no, we haven't built it yet. Something to that effect. Yeah.
Interesting. Itzkov also commented on immortality, saying, I want to leave when I want to. Mm-hmm. And he was pressured by Joe Rogan to give an answer to that question, if he wants to be immortal or not. I guess my question to you is, seeing as we have these powerful and wealthy people involved in this whole movement, is there an aspect of ego? I mean, I'm sure there is, but I mean, how influential is that aspect of, these people have built their fortune, they've built their enterprise or whatever, they've accumulated all this wealth, and just the mere thought of not existing, the thought of one day not being able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, I guess, is so overwhelming that that's kind of a driving, motivating factor behind them getting involved in supporting this whole thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, big time. Yeah, because, with life, there's certain inevitabilities in life, one being death, and there's really no way around it. And as you say, if you work your whole life working very hard and accumulating a lot of physical wealth and, fame, things like this, and people respect you, you build up a real serious life, which is, nothing wrong with that. That's obviously a good thing. But then things turn a little sour if you feel like somehow you can reverse the inevitability of death, and with these scientific ways to become immortal and whatnot. Now there's a whole new sort of justification for people who are materialistic, for one thing, but just for everybody. It's like, hey, look, yeah, immortality is real, and why would you want to die? And again, the transhumanist argument it flips so 180 degrees to anything that I would consider to be logic, that they say, oh yeah, death is evil, death is wrong, we need to eliminate it. And it's like, how could, well, it's just, I don't get it, but certainly ego is a huge factor.
Absolutely. Recently, I mentioned this before, there was an article in the Huffington Post talking about transhumanism, which was authored by Zoltan Istvan, who I understand has written a book about this subject before. In the article, he says, it's inevitable that hundreds of millions will soon come to call themselves transhumanists, if not in name, then in spirit. Many will end up supporting indefinite life extension and technologies that strip away our humanness and promote our transhumanness. Further into the future, many more will begin to discard the human body in favor of embracing synthetic forms of being. Quite remarkable to see that on a website like the Huffington Post, which obviously has a pretty big readership. So how do you respond to that? You know, this guy saying it's inevitable that regardless of what side of the fence you're on, you know, I guess the argument for transhumanism is so strong and it makes so much sense that everyone will start to come along with it.
Well, it would never be inevitable unless somebody said it was first. I think the power of just saying something is overlooked all the time. And again, we're hearing about transhumanism so much now. And with every transhumanist promo piece, you'll always hear the same thing. One of those things is that this is inevitable. It's going to happen. You're going to have to deal with it. There's no way around it. And so the inevitability is a self-fulfilling prophecy, as all things tend to be, really. This fact of life actually has a very mystic quality to it as well, which is a pretty, I don't know, I find that stuff fascinating. You speak the world into being. That's what God did in the creation myths. God spoke man into existence, and we too speak our world into existence. So it has to do with that. It's a mystic thing, but in a more mundane sense, it's just about if people hear it over and over again, that becomes their world. So I don't know.
Speaking of God, I'd like to get your reaction to this excerpt from the same article. Istvan says, if you don't care about or believe in God and you want the best of the human spirit to raise the world to new heights using science, technology, and reason, then you are a transhumanist.
Yeah. Well, this brings up a very important point, and why and how transhumanism is sort of leveraging feelings of the day to, again, be promoted. I would say that feelings of today, there's a lot of nihilism, kind of a growing sense of nihilism, whether people are consciously aware of it or not. They're very nihilistic. And also atheism is rising, I'd say, and certainly materialism. So all these forces have really come to a head as, you know, religion's been questioned and people are abandoning. As they abandon religion, they abandon, you know, all sorts of ideas that come with religion. There are a lot of valuable things within religion. Well, people like to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, you know, religion's a bunch of nonsense, so everything associated with it is too, you know, science and materialistic things. Well, that's the whole of reality. Therefore, you know, that's what my worldview is going to be. And certainly transhumanists know this. The ground level transhumanists, the people who are really into the idea, tend to be super inclined towards these points of views too. So they'll be like super atheists. They'll be like, you know, they will hate religion like viscerally. They will attack it, and they enjoy attacking it. That's one thing that they really love, is like belittling religion every way. So yeah, that's what's going on there, I think.
Interesting. Well, I guess I'm an exception to the rule because I don't subscribe to any religion, but I certainly don't support you know, this whole transhumanist movement. I think it's just, I mean, as we've documented before, I think, you know, we're getting way ahead of ourselves, and it's quite ridiculous. I guess is the way of summarizing it. Switching gears a little bit here, Aaron. I'd like to get your thoughts on a recent news item, I guess, in technology, which has been making the rounds recently, and that is the unveiling of Amazon's drones. And I know the CEO of Amazon has come out and said within 5 years they'll be able to deliver people's packages and so on using these kind of mini drones, I guess you could say. And I guess as with everything these days, there's been a mixture of excitement and also trepidation that's come along with this news. Do you see? I mean, obviously, whenever people make predictions, it can be a kind of a risky business. But do you see within 5 years, you walking down the street and looking up and seeing a bunch of drones carrying Amazon packages?
It certainly is possible, and I know that I actually watched that piece on 60 Minutes Live, which is amazing. I never really watched the show, but I was home for the holidays and it just happened to come on. I happened to see it. So what I found interesting about that was they mentioned that one of the major reasons that they're not really doing it, it's an R&D thing for one with the drones, but there's also regulatory for like the FAA or whatever for flight and for actually sending these things in the air. The regulations aren't such that you could actually do this yet. But the CEO, I can't remember that guy's name. He was mentioning like, oh yeah, that'll change, and when that does change, then we'll really be able to implement it. You'll find that all the reports on automation say the same thing, because it'd be possible with the technology that exists now to create an automated highway with cars that just drive themselves, the trucks that drive themselves, no more human drivers. You could set up the infrastructure to do it. You could implement driverless cars. It's just the legal framework and things like that to do so. The laws aren't in place for like insurance purposes and all this.
It's funny. There's all this talk of drones delivering mail and iPads and iPhones and all that stuff. We live in an incredible age, but we still don't have the flying cars. I mean, people for 50, 60 years now have been saying, the 21st century will be the era of the flying cars, and they're still not here. There's
lots of people upset about that, yeah.
Indeed. Well, as we wrap things up here, Aaron, I just want to thank you so much again for joining me on the show, and it's great to get even more of your thoughts on this subject, which I think is fascinating, and it's something that I try to track as much as possible. I'd just like to give you the floor to maybe make any final comments and let people know where they can check out more of your stuff.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you, of course, Guy, for having me on the show. It's really a great podcast. I love Smells Like Human Spirit. I listen to it all the time, and so good work here. And
thank you.
Yeah, no, not a problem. It's definitely a cool thing. Other than that, I mean, my website is ageoftransitions.com. I have a lot of articles I've written in the past. I put out quite a few podcasts, Transresistor Radio, as you said, the upcoming series about alternative media where I do lots of interviews. That's going to be coming up. I'm also having the Themes and Memes episodes and some roundtable discussions I've had with some folks too will be coming onto the feed there. So, I'm just always doing stuff at ageoftransitions.com, so people will check it out.
Absolutely. Be sure to check that out, ageoftransitions.com. My guest again was Aaron Franz. Aaron, we'll definitely do this again in the future, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, there you have it. That's it for another edition of Smells Like Human Spirit. Many thanks go out to Aaron Franz once again for his time. It's always great to catch up with Aaron and get the latest in regards to the world of transhumanism, which I find quite fascinating and quite concerning as well. I titled this episode Transhumanism Goes Mainstream, and people have been saying that for 7 or 8 years or so. But if you look at the media coverage of these type of themes that we talked about today, there really has been a steady increase, I think, in the last year or two, whether it's in popular television series or film, as we discussed in the episode, or even the recent sci-fi series, Joe Rogan Questions Everything. We really see that this topic is being mentioned more and more, and it's not just science fiction, it's not just speculation. This is something that rich and powerful individuals across the world seem to want to happen, at least several of them do. Anyway, I can't speak for all of them, of course, but there seem to be people such as the Russian billionaire Dmitry Itskov that believe this is absolutely the next step for humanity, that we need to kind of merge with machines and we need to look into life extension technology and we should basically accept the technology as part of us, which I think is very unwise, clearly. I think you guys know my perspective by now. I think there is a big difference between being intelligent and being wise, and even though there might be some very smart minds looking into this whole subject, I really don't think it's in our best interest as human beings to make ourselves redundant, as bizarre as that sounds. So, as I say, people have been making the point that transhumanism went mainstream a while ago, but just consider that last year the world's first transhumanist politician was elected over in Italy, a man by the name of Giuseppe Vattino. I think that shows how these ideas are picking up more steam. Prior to becoming a politician, he wrote several books on this topic and very much identifies as a transhumanist. And just several days ago in the Huffington Post, there was another article by Zoltan Istvan, who again we mentioned in our conversation. And the title of this article, if you guys want to look into it, is it time for a transhumanist Olympics? And Zoltan says in this piece, rather than change traditional sporting events, which holds a special place in many of our hearts, why not add a whole new category to them? For a moment, imagine a transhumanist Olympic Games, a place for athletes in the 21st century who have modified themselves with drugs, technologies, and bionic enhancements. Now, yes, it might be cool to imagine someone running the 100 meters in 4 seconds because they've been enhanced through technology or the use of drugs or whatever, but it isn't ethical, nor is it wise, once again. It's just such a short-term view in my eyes, and he's not the first person to propose that we just kind of have a free-for-all Olympic Games where we take out all the rules and regulations and, you know, athletes can just go crazy and take whatever they want, and it would be such a spectacle. But again, the cost would be human beings, and that seems to be the central theme of all of this, from my vantage point anyway, is just the lack of respect for our species for whatever reason. It's extremely bizarre to me. But I guess if I had to summarize my general thoughts, when I first heard about this subject, I kind of treated it as a fringe topic, something that really wasn't that serious. But it's quite clear that more and more people are starting to kind of propose the idea, at least on a very basic level, that we need to use technology to kind of merge with ourselves and take that next step in our evolution. And my response to that would be that nature seems to work pretty well on its own without our direct involvement or our direct hand in the process. In fact, when we try to control nature, that seems to be when we mess up the planet. And we can all think of various examples of where human beings have damaged and destroyed the planet. And now we seem to be doing it with our own bodies. So I don't think we need to take this direct hand to kind of evolve our species at this advanced rate. Things are going to happen the way that they happen. I really don't think that we need to get involved to that extent. That's my perspective. You might be listening to this, you might have a completely different perspective, but I think given our track record as human beings to kind of mess things up when we try to control them too much, we probably need to learn as a people that, you know what, nature in its own way and in its own time is going to do whatever it does, and we just kind of have to roll with the punches and go with it. You know, there's so much that we still don't understand, and I think this is just really arrogance ratcheted up to the nth degree. The idea that, you know, we need to almost become half machine, half gods at this point. So I'm definitely going to be tracking this topic in the future. I'm sure in a lot of the big releases this year and in the future, as far as movies go and television and all sorts of popular media, we'll see these themes explored more. So it'll be interesting to see how they're portrayed, and interesting to see how the public opinion kind of changes over time, and the public discourse that's made possible because all of this. Before we get out of here, guys, I just want to follow up on something I said before yesterday's podcast. You may remember that I asked for feedback from you in terms of how you're enjoying the daily shows so far. I also would like to know how you listen to the podcast. Is it on the way to work? Is it at the gym? Is it doing the chores around the house? Just because it gives me an idea as far as the ideal length for the shows. And I got an interesting comment via the Facebook page from Paul Rowe, who says, "It's nice to have daily shows, though to be honest, I preferred and missed the more in-depth shows that used to be done." And he goes on to say that he misses the shows that used to be 1 to 2 hours in duration. And I found this interesting. First of all, thank you very much, Paul, for writing in. But I found this interesting because the length of this podcast very rarely has ever been 1 to 2 hours. I think the longest show I've ever done is perhaps 90 minutes or so. And of course, from time to time, we go extra long. Sometimes we finish a bit short. But I think since the inception of this show, it's tended to clock in, most episodes clock in at around 40 minutes or so. But I just wanted to put that out there for the rest of you guys listening, because maybe you've had similar thoughts to Paul. Maybe you completely disagree with that. I don't know. Let me know anyway. What do you think? Do you think 30 to 40 minutes on a daily basis is the way to go? Do you think maybe it should be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter? Do you think that the length is irrelevant, it's more about the content, and it's more about perhaps the topic and the guest? I don't know. I'm just interested to hear what you guys think, so please get back to me on that. The last thing that I will say as well, I mentioned this yesterday, but I'll repeat it again today, kind of toying with the idea of doing a live show where you guys can call in and contribute to the discussion. And I have to give credit where credit's due. This is, in fact, Aaron's idea, the same Aaron Franz that I interviewed for this podcast. He was the one who suggested that maybe I float that idea out there. So please let me know what you guys think. Not sure as far as the specifics in terms of how I would work it out, what time of day it would be, what day it would be, etc. But it's something that I'm definitely looking into. So please get back to me on that one. And with all that being said, I just want to thank you all for listening and choosing the Smells Like Human Spirit podcast. I hope you find it entertaining, and I will see you guys again tomorrow. Or more accurately, you will hear from me again tomorrow. All right, take care, guys, and peace.